In the DPR Description of Physical Reality paper of 1935, the basic thesis put forward is that without a concept of causality, there can be no scientific statement of physical reality. So what Einstein is saying is, if the concepts used, and he says the chief concept involved is that of the still state, or Eigenstand, the physical reality involved will not be completely represented, and therefore you don't have what you aim at in a physical science. Or put another way, the science that Einstein thinks of here is one where the truth of it can be kept in human terms, because humans require at least the concept of cause and effect to make intelligible what we're talking about. He says that the problem here is with the so-called crossing of the arms, or the entanglement, which means that there's, so in physics the system dealt with is supposed to be a discrete system, or put another way, it's supposed to be a system where you know what counts as connecting with other things as being part of the how do they call it, commutative system, where things influence one another. So the problem with the so-called entanglement problem is that you have a system like this, which you know is interconnected, and then it becomes 1 and 2, or A and B. It splits, so that you have one side that's the polarized one way and one side the other way. And when they're split, they're bound to come into contact with some stuff that wasn't there in the original commutative unity, so that the Schrodinger's method is a kind of method like that of Bayes, very Bayesian, which we can exemplify with the Monty Hall problem, where you go and kind of search for evidence as against the standard bell curve type of way of creating a distribution, a probability distribution expectation, which then later on in physics we get the multi-worlds interpretation. So there's really two ways you can go with making predictions of this kind, and that those are them. So besides from Schrodinger, we have the matrix idea, which corresponds to the film, at least in its concept, which is to go blind and not consider causality in the same way, which is Heisenberg's way of doing it, which is in quite a few videos misrepresented to say that Einstein didn't understand what Heisenberg was doing with his matrix equations. Of course he did, but he merely said this is just another form of incompleteness. This is just another form of an incomplete look at things that we want to have a complete look at, and then they would be as deterministic as classical physics. So this is a conceptual, and I guess some other people would come up with some other ideas in the same range. But so the main issue is what happens is that you look at A or you look at B, and then you get some information in the same sense as in the Monty Hall problem, which then makes it easier to predict what's happening. If you look at A, it's easier then to predict what's happening in B. If you look at B, it's easier to predict what's happening in A. But it's a statistical information issue. Very widely misrepresented as an issue of physical connection, instantaneous or faster than light physical connection. So the point is that since you need the information, since it's like a key, just like in the Monty Hall problem, if you know that in the Monty Hall problem that the bad things or the goats rather than the prize have been deliberately removed, then and only then does it make sense to change your original guess. So it's in fact, I think it's just the same as the Bayesian reasoning in the Monty Hall problem. It's a matter of you learn some stuff and it makes it more sensible to make that prediction, but it's still statistical. So it's interesting on an aside that Carl Jung, when he was asked to, or when he had the chance to have a few minute conversation with Einstein, was then asked whether he mentioned his thinking to Einstein, and he replied, when a man is so concentrated on his idea, then nothing can be done. So Jung couldn't broach his thinking with Einstein because Einstein was so absorbed with his idea. Thinking of the recent issues in Russian warfare, one can see it's correct the way Cornel West is reasoning when he says empires have this kind of behavior. So it's not a matter of Putin and specifically, but not just because 500,000 or more, or I think quite a bit more, were killed in Iraq and in Libya and other places. I think that there's a website on a major university with the Cost of War website, which is America's killed more than 1 million in the last 20 years, I believe. But it's not just that, it's also this specific inheritance. So Bertrand Russell has said against Churchill, saying he's not exactly against it, but well, I guess we should say against it. I was going to say refined. He's refined the Churchill statement about democracy is the worst possible form of government, meaning it's bad, but it's the only one that's at all plausible or possible. Russell has said democracy is good where it will work. So he said it wouldn't work in Russia for sure, and he knows this very well. He was raised by his grandparents. His grandfather, a two-time prime minister who had met Napoleon on Elba in his youth. He knows the thinking of the circles of the people that run countries, and how what their dealings were with the Russians in the 19th century. So he could see that it's not the right soil, so that therefore we have a misguided criticism, because it's based on the notion as I mentioned that Condoleezza Rice was saying, the American tradition of idealism means basically that they think the principles on which government is founded will be determinate for their behavior in the international community. But this isn't really so, because it's very obvious, and so for instance there's a good statement of it in Justice Kennedy's, former Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's confirmation hearing. But this statement that the laws on the book, the form of the government, the politeia, as was called by Plato, the spirit of the laws, as he called by Montesquieu, these don't matter if they're too much at odds with the vision and the sentiments of the people. There's an interesting statement that parallels the Einstein statement that I came across looking at something on the Turkmenistan War of 1880 and 81 by a certain General Mikhail Skobelev is written back to the Central Command saying, send me officers whose sole idea, we were just talking about Einstein being so concentrated on his idea that Jung couldn't even talk to him about anything else. Send me officers whose sole idea is their duty and who do not entertain visionary sentiments. And I was thinking specifically of some kind of sentiments aimed at softening the horrors of war, I suppose. There's then another interesting comment, which is that it was said that when he was go into battle, his eyes would gleam and his voice would be full of joy and excitement, and that the physical excitement would bring those who were in battle with him to transport, bring them over to that same excited state. This reminds of certain of the Russian generals today in a way that certainly we can't see in anything since maybe Patton, I don't know, but I can't detect that in any of the current living generals in America. You had that in the Robert Duvall character in the Coppola movie. But it's not quite the same thing as this sort of Cossack behavior sort of notion. So I think this kind of notion of somebody who's totally in their idea is interesting from a Heideggerian perspective and from a Jungian perspective. One basic, we could start a kind of, if we think of Heidegger, as he says in the second Schelling lectures, the 1941 Schelling lectures, that his main point is to raise the question of being, and then this analytic of Dasein, which then starts with things like the Zuhanden and the Vorhanden and certain other basics such as facticity or Geworfenheit as against the fallenness, or the going towards something which is like in a way like the perfection seeking hunger, or the notion of Socrates as a passionate man, in the sense that the horses in the Phaedrus, when they catch the scent of the good, whinny. And so catching the scent is physical pathos. It's something acting on them from outside, rather than the activation of their essence out of speech or out of the logos. So uh, if we define Dasein as this logos being, because being there means uh, you're somewhere, and then your essence is activated, and the activation of the essence means speech, understanding, logos, which is ratio in Latin, which is reason, rationality, etc. This activation of the essence in existence as what knows that existence is then the core of Dasein. I wanted to superimpose on that, then taken that then we don't have to stay with just the specific sorties or attempts Heidegger made, but we could put Jung, for instance, superimpose Jung's objectivity, or extroversion and introversion over the basic types. So if we think of Zuhanden and Vorhanden in something like how we are for ourselves and then how we are from outside, rather than something like saying the inner, because I think that's misleading. How we are for ourselves doesn't mean inner. It just means rather than how we are sort of from outside, and then in a confusing sense from ourselves, understanding ourselves as we would be seen from outside, this Das Man concept, which is Heidegger shows it in by pointing to the death of Ivan Ilyich, the Tolstoy story. But over that, I think we can impose the notion of extrovert and introvert understood in the strict way. So we're not talking about that some people are more more loquacious or something like that, or are more approachable so much. That may go with it in many cases, but we're also talking about, or in the stricter sense, we're talking about somebody who makes things into their object, as against someone who takes things as a kind of picture book around them, so that they're surrounded somehow. So that's also, I think, a basic track into this kind of Heideggerian investigation. But the main point that Heidegger brings out in those lectures, when after, so Being in Time comes out in 1927, those lectures are in 41, so that's like 13 or 14 years, or I guess maybe 15 if you push it back to when he actually wrote it, something like that. He's responding to, I suppose, more than a decade's worth of critiques of it, and he's saying this analytic of Dasein isn't necessary. We can approach this question of the raising of the question of being without that first step, but that was just one attempt. So we could make other attempts, and therefore thinking of it in a Jungian way as one of the basics of Dasein is fully legitimate, and the project is, therefore it has Entwicklung Fähigkeit, it has the capacity to be developed from within itself, that's still alive. If it didn't have this capacity to be developed, then it wouldn't be a living teaching in this sense of Entwicklung Fähigkeit, which is important for a Gambit. We can say there's something in that which is speaks against what we usually think philosophy is doing, insofar as it would be trying to come to the truth out of opinion, trying to raise from opinion to the truth, where the truth is a final state, and then you could put it down in a system as in Hegel or etc.